The first rays of dawn were breaking over the mountains when Jake finally convinced Lyra to rest, and she had spent hours explaining what materials she needed to repair her ship, and most of it made no sense to him because she talked about quantum resonators and plasma conduits and energy matrices. But he wrote it all down anyway and promised to find what he could. In town, Lyra fell asleep on his couch, and even unconscious. She looked worried, and Jake covered her with a blanket and then went outside to look at the ship in daylight, and what he saw made his stomach drop because the crash site was obvious and huge, and anyone flying overhead would see it immediately, and he needed to hide it fast before someone called the authorities. He spent the morning dragging old tarps and hay bales to the crater and covering the ship as best he could, and the metal was still warm to the touch, and occasionally it would hum or pulse with light, and he wondered what kind of technology could cross the vast emptiness of space and whether humans would ever build something like it. When he came back inside, Lyra was awake and standing by his window, and she turned to look at him and said that she had scanned his planet while he worked and that humans were on the verge of becoming a spacefaring species but were also violent and divided. And she asked him why his people fought each other when there was so much universe to explore together. Jake did not have a good answer, and he made breakfast and watched in fascination as Lyra examined the eggs and bacon and toast with scientific curiosity. And she ate carefully and said that the food was surprisingly compatible with her biology, and that human agriculture was impressively efficient for such a young civilization. They spent the day working on a plan, and Lyra used her wrist device to create holographic displays that showed the internal damage to her ship, and Jake learned that she needed copper wire and certain electronic components in something called a magnetic field generator, and he thought he might be able to find most of it at the hardware store and the salvage yard outside town. Before he left, Lyra gave him a small device that looked like a coin, and she said it would translate any writing into his language and also scan materials to see if they would work for the repairs. And Jake put it in his pocket and felt the weight of it, and realized he was now carrying technology more advanced than anything on Earth. The drive to town felt surreal, and Jake kept expecting to wake up and find it had all been a dream. But the device in his pocket was real, and when he stopped at a red light, he saw a jet flying overhead and thought about how primitive it would look compared to Lyra's ship, and how humanity had no idea that someone was watching from the stars. He went to 3 different stores and a salvage yard and bought everything he could think of that might help, and people gave him strange looks when he asked for large quantities of copper wire and old electronics. But he made up a story about building a radio antenna, and they seemed to accept it, and he loaded his truck and drove home faster than he should have. Lyra was working on something when he arrived, and she had taken apart his old radio and his toaster and several other appliances and spread them across his kitchen table. And she looked up when he came in, and her face brightened, and she said she had found some useful components, and that humans built their technology in clever ways that reminded her of her own people when they were younger. They worked together through the afternoon and into the evening, and Jake helped Lyra carry materials out to the ship, and he watched in amazement as she used tools that looked like pens made of light to cut through metal and fuse components together and seal cracks in the hull, and her hands moved with practiced precision. And he realized she was not just a scout, but an engineer. As the sun set, Lyra stopped working and sat down heavily on the ground, and Jake could see exhaustion in every line of her body, and he asked if she was okay, and she said that her people did not need much sleep, but they did need to rest, and that she was pushing herself too hard because time was running out. Jake made dinner, and they ate together on his porch and watched the stars come out, and Lyra pointed to different constellations and told him their real names and which ones had planets with life and which ones held dangers that humanity should avoid when they finally reached the stars. And Jake listened and felt very small and very lucky at the same time. He asked her about her homeworld, and her face became sad and beautiful at once, and she told him about cities that floated on clouds and oceans that glowed with bioluminescent creatures, and music that was created by the wind flowing through crystal forests. And she said that her people valued honor above all else, and that they had been fighting the Empire for 3 generations. The Empire, she explained, believed that strong species had the right to dominate weak ones, and they had conquered dozens of worlds and enslaved populations and taken resources and destroyed cultures, and Lyra's people had formed an alliance with other free species to resist them. And the war had cost millions of lives on both sides, Jake asked why the Empire wanted her so badly, and Lyra looked down at her hands and said that she carried information in her ship's computer about the location of the Alliance's hidden bases and supply routes, and if the Empire captured her, they could destroy everything her people had built and kill everyone she loved. And that was why she had to repair her ship and escape before the hunters arrived. He wanted to ask more questions, but Lyra suddenly stood up, and her body went rigid, and she was staring at the sky. And Jake followed her gaze but saw nothing except stars. And then she said very quietly that she had detected a hyperspace signature, and that a ship had just entered the solar system and was scanning for her energy signature. Fear hit Jake like ice water, and he asked how long they had, and Lyra said maybe 12 hours if they were lucky, and maybe less if the hunters had good tracking equipment, and her ship was not ready, and would not be ready in time. And for the first time since she crashed, he saw real fear in her eyes. They went back to work with desperate urgency, and Jake stopped asking questions and just did whatever Lyra told him to do. And the hours blurred together, and his hands were cut and burned from handling hot metal and strange materials, and his back ached from climbing in and out of the ship. But he did not stop because stopping meant giving up. Around midnight, Lyra climbed out of the ship and told Jake that she had done everything she could, but the main power core was still damaged and would only give her one jump, and maybe not even a full one, and she would have to jump blind and hope she came out somewhere near her fleet and not in the middle of a star. Jake asked what would happen if the hunters found her before the ship was ready, and Lyra did not answer right away, and then she said they would take her alive if possible, and torture her for information and then kill her. And they would probably destroy his farm and maybe his entire town to hide the evidence, and he felt anger burn through his fear. He told her he would not let that happen, and she looked at him with those shifting eyes and asked what one human could do against trained soldiers with advanced weapons, and Jake said he did not know, but he would figure something out because she had crashed on his land, and that made her his responsibility, and also because in just 2 days she had become important to him in ways he could not explain. Lyra reached out and touched his face, and her hand was warm and soft, and she said that humans were braver than they knew, and that Jake reminded her of why her people were fighting to protect freedom across the galaxy. And then she kissed him, and her lips tasted like starlight, and something electric passed between them. And Jake knew that whatever happened next, he would stand with her. Jake Turner had lived on the Montana farm for 30 years, and every night was the same, with silence broken only by crickets and the occasional coyote howl, but tonight felt different in a way he could not explain as he sat on his porch drinking coffee and watching the sky turn from orange to deep purple, and the stars began to appear one by one like tiny holes punched in dark fabric. He was thinking about fixing the fence near the north pasture when he saw it, and at first he thought it was a shooting star, but then he realized it was growing larger and brighter and moving in a way that no meteor ever moved, because it was changing direction and slowing down and leaving a trail of blue fire across the heavens that lit up the entire valley. The object screamed overhead so close that Jake could feel the heat on his face, and the sound was like nothing he had ever heard before, like thunder mixed with the roar of a jet engine and glass breaking all at once, and then it slammed into his wheat field with such force that the ground shook and threw him backwards off his chair, and he hit the porch hard, enough to knock the wind from his lungs. For a moment Jake just lay there staring up at the sky and wondering if he had imagined it. But then he saw the glow rising from beyond his barn, and it pulsed with an unnatural blue light that made shadows dance across his house, and smoke and dust filled the air, and he could smell something burning that was not wood or grass, but something metallic and strange. He got to his feet slowly, and his hands were shaking as he grabbed his flashlight from inside the house, and part of him wanted to call the sheriff or the fire department, but a bigger part of him needed to see what had fallen from the sky and landed on his property, and so he started running across his yard toward the field with his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The wheat had been flattened in a wide circle, and as Jake pushed through the damaged crops, he saw the crater, and it was massive, at least 20 feet across and maybe 10 feet deep, and sitting in the center of it was something that made his brain struggle to understand what his eyes were seeing, because it was a ship, but not like any aircraft he had ever seen. The hull was smooth and curved with no visible seams or rivets, and its surface seemed to shift colors as he watched, changing from silver to purple to something that looked like liquid, Mercury and strange symbols glowed along its side in patterns that hurt to look at for too long, and steam hissed from cracks in the armor, and small fires burned where pieces had broken off during the crash. Jake stood at the edge of the crater with his flashlight beam playing across the wreckage, and his mind was racing because this was not human technology, and that meant it came from somewhere else, and the implications of that made him dizzy. And he took a step closer and then another, and the heat radiating from the ship made sweat break out on his forehead. Then he heard a sound like wind chimes mixed with the hiss of hydraulics, and a section of the hull began to open and light spilled out from inside the ship, and it was not white or yellow but a soft blue glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and Jake froze, with his flashlight pointed at the opening door, because something was coming out. A figure emerged from the light, and Jake expected something terrifying like the aliens from movies with tentacles or multiple eyes or dripping jaws, but instead he saw what looked like a woman, and she stepped out onto the edge of the doorway, and then her legs gave out and she fell and tumbled down the side of the crater and landed hard on the dirt. Without thinking, Jake ran forward and slid down into the crater and reached her side, and up close he could see that she was definitely not human, but she was still the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and her skin had a faint shimmer like moonlight reflecting off water and seemed to glow very slightly from within, and her hair was long and silver and moved as if stirred by an underwater current, even though there was no breeze. Her eyes opened and looked up at him, and they were large and almond-shaped, and the color kept shifting between blue and purple and green like an oil slick in sunlight, and they held such depth and intelligence that Jake felt like she could see right through him to his very soul. And she tried to speak, but the words were like music mixed with sounds no human throat could make. She reached up with one hand, and her fingers were long and delicate, and she touched something on her wrist that looked like a bracelet made of living metal, and it pulsed with light. And then she spoke again, and this time Jake understood the words perfectly, even though he knew she was not speaking English. She said her name was Lyra, and that she needed help because her ship was dying and she could not repair it alone, and enemies were hunting her and would arrive soon. And she looked at him with such desperate hope mixed with fear that something in his chest tightened, and he knew without question that he was going to help her no matter what happened. Jake helped Lyra to her feet, and she was taller than him by several inches, and she wore a suit that seemed to be made of fabric and technology woven together, and it hugged her form and glowed with faint lines of light that pulsed in rhythm with her breathing, and parts of it were torn and burned, and he could see wounds beneath where the fabric had been damaged. He asked her what happened, and she told him as he helped her climb out of the crater that she was a scout for her people who were fighting a war against an empire that wanted to conquer every species they encountered and enslave entire worlds, and she had been in a battle, and her ship had been damaged, and she had made a blind jump through space to escape and ended up here on Earth completely by accident. Lyra stumbled, and Jake caught her and realized she was hurt worse than he thought, and her breathing was labored, and when he looked at his hand there was something on it that looked like blood, but it shimmered with tiny flecks of light, and he told her he was taking her to his house, and she tried to protest, saying her ship needed immediate attention, but her legs gave out again and he had to carry her. She was lighter than he expected, and as he walked across his field toward the farmhouse with this alien woman in his arms, Jake realized that his life had just changed in ways he could not begin to comprehend, and the quiet existence he had built over decades was gone forever, and tomorrow the world would know that humans were not alone in the universe, but tonight it was just him and Lyra and a crashed ship glowing blue in his wheat field. Carried her up the porch steps and into his house and laid her on his couch, and she looked around at the simple furniture and the pictures on the walls and the television in the corner, and she smiled despite her pain and said that his home felt peaceful and safe. And Jake went to get his first aid kit, knowing it was probably useless for alien injuries, but needing to do something. When he came back, Lyra was touching her wrist device again and studying him with those incredible shifting eyes, and she said that his species was younger than hers and had not yet reached the stars, but that she could sense great potential in humanity, and in him specifically. And Jake did not know what to say to that, so he just asked her to tell him what she needed and how he could help. Lyra explained that her ship required rare materials to repair, and that she had maybe 3 days before the Empire hunters found her trail and arrived to finish what they started. And Jake felt cold fear run down his spine. because he knew that if hostile aliens arrived, they would not care about one farmer or one small planet, and everything he knew could be destroyed. But when he looked at Lyra, he also knew he could not abandon her. The sun was barely up when Lyra's wrist device started beeping with urgent pulses of red light, and she looked at Jake with wide eyes and said the hunters had entered Earth's atmosphere and were maybe an hour away and moving fast, and his farm was directly in their path and they were out of time. Jake felt his heart hammering, but his hands were steady as he asked what they should do, and Lyra said they had two choices and both were bad, and they could run and hide, but the hunters would find them eventually and destroy everything looking for her, or they could stand and fight with a damaged ship and primitive weapons against trained soldiers. And Jake said fighting sounded better than hiding. Lyra smiled at him and said that was the most human response possible. And then she ran to her ship and started activating systems, and Jake could hear the engines powering up, and the sound was like a hurricane mixed with electricity, and the whole ship began to glow with blue light that pulsed in steady rhythm. He asked what she was doing, and Lyra said she was setting a trap, because the hunters would expect her to be helpless and scared, and they would land close and send soldiers to capture her, and they would not expect her damaged scout ship to have any weapons left, and that overconfidence would be their weakness. Jake watched as panels on the ship's hull slid open and revealed weapons that looked like they were made of crystal and light, and Lyra explained that they were plasma cannons and would only fire a few times before the damaged power core burned out, but a few times might be enough, and she programmed them to target anything that was not human or marked with her genetic signature. Then she turned to Jake and handed him a weapon that looked like a pistol, but was made of the same shifting metal as her suit, and she showed him how to hold it and where to point it, and said it would fire energy bolts that could punch through armor, and that he should aim for center mass and not try to be fancy. Jake took the weapon and felt the weight of it, and part of him could not believe he was about to fight actual aliens with technology from another world. But another part of him felt calm and clear, because this was his home and Lyra was under his protection, and he would not let anyone take her without a fight. They moved to positions on opposite sides of the crater, and Lyra gave him a communicator that fit in his ear, and she told him to stay hidden until the soldiers were distracted by her, and then to fire from behind, and that their armor was strong but not perfect, and repeated hits in the same spot would eventually break through. The weight was terrible, and Jake crouched behind a pile of hay bales with the alien weapon in his sweating hands and watched the sky, and wondered if this was how soldiers felt before battle. And then he saw it, and his breath caught because the hunter ship was descending, and it was 3 times bigger than Lyra's scout vessel and black as oil, and it absorbed light instead of reflecting it. The ship landed in his wheat field and crushed what was left of his crops, and a ramp extended from its belly, and soldiers emerged, and Jake counted 6 of them, and they wore armor that looked like it was made from pieces of night sky, and their helmets had no visible eyes, but he knew they could see, because they moved with purpose toward Lyra's position. Lyra stood up from behind her ship and shouted something in her language, and the soldiers stopped, and their leader stepped forward and spoke through a translator, and his voice was cold and mechanical, and he said that Lyra was a traitor to the natural order, and that she would surrender immediately, or watch the primitive human settlement be destroyed. Jake felt rage burn through him at the casual way the soldier threatened his home, and he tightened his grip on the weapon and waited for Lyra's signal, and she was talking to the soldiers and buying time and telling them that her ship's computer core was damaged beyond repair, and that the information they wanted was lost. The leader did not believe her, and gestured to 2 soldiers, and they started walking toward the scout ship with weapons raised, and that was when Lyra activated the trap, and suddenly her ship came alive with light, and the plasma cannons fired, and the sound was like reality being torn apart. The first soldier was hit dead center, and his armor exploded in a shower of sparks, and he went down hard and did not move, and the second soldier tried to dodge, but the cannon tracked him and fired again and caught him in the shoulder and spun him around, and he fell screaming. The other soldiers scattered and returned fire, and their weapons made sounds like angry hornets, and energy bolts cratered the ground around Lyra's ship, and she ducked behind cover and shouted for Jake to fire now, and he stood up and aimed and pulled the trigger. The alien pistol kicked in his hand and fired a bolt of pure white energy that crossed the distance in an instant and hit one soldier in the back, and the armor held but cracked, and the soldier stumbled and turned to find the new threat, And Jake fired again, and again, and the third shot punched through and the soldier dropped. Jake dove behind the hay bales as return fire tore through his position and burned holes in the bales and set them smoldering, and he could smell burning straw and ozone, and his ears were ringing from the weapon's fire. And he rolled to a new position and popped up and fired again. Lyra's cannons were still firing but slower now, and Jake could see smoke coming from her ship and knew the power core was failing. And 2 soldiers were down, and 3 were still standing, plus the leader, and the odds were still bad, but they were better than before. 1 soldier rushed Lyra's position, and she came out from behind cover with a blade that glowed with the same energy as the plasma cannons, and she moved faster than Jake thought possible, and the blade cut through the soldier's weapon and then through his armor, and he fell in 2 pieces that sparked and smoked. The leader roared something and raised his own weapon, and it was bigger than the others, and Jake knew it was bad, and he aimed carefully and fired and hit the leader's weapon, and it exploded in his hands, and the leader was thrown backwards and his armor was scorched, but intact. Jake ran forward without thinking, and the last standing soldier turned toward him and fired, and the bolt passed so close to Jake's head that he felt the heat and smelled burning hair. And then Lyra was there, and her blade flashed, and the soldier's helmet came off and rolled away, and the soldier fell. The leader was getting up and reaching for another weapon, and Jake pointed his pistol at him and told him to stop, and the leader looked at him, and even through the damaged armor, Jake could feel the contempt and hatred, and the leader said that humans were insects and would be crushed when the Empire came. Lyra walked up beside Jake with her blade still glowing, and she said something in her language, and the leader responded, and they argued back and forth, and finally, Lyra turned to Jake and said that she had given the leader a choice, and he could leave and report failure, or he could die here. And the leader chose to leave. The black ship lifted off with just its leader aboard and left the dead soldiers behind, and Jake watched it climb into the sky and disappear, and then his legs gave out and he sat down hard on the ground and started shaking, and Lyra knelt beside him and put her hand on his shoulder. She said that he had fought with courage and that his people would be legends among the stars someday, and Jake laughed weakly and said he just did not want anyone hurting his friend. And Lyra smiled and said that humans had a gift for making bonds quickly and deeply, and that was both their strength and their weakness. They went back to her ship, and the damage from the battle was extensive, and Lyra said that the power core would give her 1 jump, and maybe not even a complete one, but staying here was not an option because more hunters would come, and next time they would bring bigger ships and more soldiers. Jake helped her make final repairs, and they worked in silence, and he knew what was coming and did not want to face it, but finally, the ship was as ready as it would ever be. And Lyra turned to him, and her eyes were full of sadness and something else that made his chest ache. Jake stood beside Lyra's ship and watched her check systems one final time, and the blue glow of the engines reflected off her silver hair and made her look like something from a dream, and he wanted to ask her to stay, but knew he could not, because she had a duty to her people and a war to fight, and his small farm was not enough to keep her here. Lyra finished her checks and walked over to him, and she looked tired and sad and beautiful all at once, and she said that her ship would barely make the jump to where her fleet was supposed to be, and that if her calculations were wrong, she might end up anywhere in the galaxy. And Jake asked what the chances were that she would make it safely. She smiled and said that the odds were not good, but she had survived worse, and that her people had a saying that courage was not about ignoring danger, but about facing it anyway. And Jake said that humans had a similar saying, and maybe their people were not so different after all. He asked her what would happen next, and Lyra said that once she reached her fleet, she would report everything that happened here, and that Earth would be marked as a protected world, and that the Alliance would make sure the Empire did not come here looking for revenge. And Jake felt relief wash over him because he had been worried about his planet. But then Lyra said that her people had rules about contacting young civilizations, and that humans needed to reach the stars on their own, without outside help, and that meant she could not come back until humanity had developed faster than light travel, and that could take decades or even centuries. Jake felt something break inside his chest, and he asked if she was saying they would never see each other again. And Lyra touched his face and said, "Never was a long time, and that the universe had strange ways of bringing people together, and that she would wait for humanity to reach the stars. And when they did, she would be there." She pulled a small crystal from her suit and placed it in his hand, and it was warm and pulsed with soft light, and she said it was a memory stone, and that it contained everything she had learned about Earth and about him, and that when humans finally developed the right technology, they would be able to read it and know that they had a friend among the stars. Jake closed his hand around the crystal and said he would keep it safe, and that he would tell people about her when the time was right, and that humanity would reach for the stars and find her, and Lyra said she believed him, because in the short time they had known each other, he had shown more courage than most trained soldiers. They stood looking at each other, and Jake knew he should say something meaningful, but all he could think about was how empty his farm would feel without her, and how the stars would look different now knowing she was out there somewhere. And finally he just said, "Thank you for crashing into his life." Lyra laughed, and it sounded like music mixed with tears, and she said that, of all the planets in all the galaxy, she was glad she crashed on his, and then she kissed him. And this time it was not urgent or desperate, but soft and gentle and full of goodbye. And when she pulled away, Jake could see tears in her strange, shifting eyes. She walked to her ship and climbed inside and turned to wave at him one last time, and then the door closed and the engines began to roar, and Jake backed away as the ship lifted slowly from the crater and hovered for a moment, and he could see Lyra through the transparent section of the hull, and she was looking down at him. Then with a flash of blue light that lit up the entire valley, the ship shot into the sky and left a trail of fire across the morning, and Jake watched until it was just a star, and then less than a star, and then nothing at all. And he stood alone in his destroyed wheat field with a crystal in his hand and an ache in his heart. The next few days were strange and difficult, and Jake had to explain the crater and the damaged crops and the scorch marks to people who came asking questions, and he told them it was a meteor strike, and they seemed to accept it, even though some looked skeptical, and eventually everyone stopped asking and life went back to normal. But Jake knew nothing was normal anymore, and every night he sat on his porch and looked at the stars and wondered where Lyra was, and if she had made it safely to her fleet, and if she ever thought about the farmer who helped her. And sometimes he took out the memory crystal and held it and felt its warmth and remembered. Months passed and then years, and Jake kept farming and kept living his quiet life, but he was different now, and people noticed, but did not understand. And he dated a few women from town, but none of them made him feel what he felt when Lyra looked at him with those shifting eyes full of stars. He started reading everything he could about space and astronomy and physics, and he donated money to programs that worked on space exploration. And he wrote letters to politicians urging them to fund faster-than-light research. And some people thought he was crazy, but he did not care. One night 10 years after Lyra left, Jake was on his porch when he saw something in the sky. And at first he thought it was just a satellite, but then he realized it was moving wrong, and his heart started pounding because he knew that movement, and he grabbed his binoculars and looked up. It was not Lyra's ship, but it was clearly not human either, and Jake watched as it hung in orbit and then shot away toward the other side of the planet. And he knew what it meant, and that humanity had been noticed, and that first contact was coming, whether people were ready or not. The next morning, the news was full of reports about UFO sightings, and the government held press conferences and admitted that, yes, they had detected something, and no, they did not know what it was, but they were investigating, and Jake smiled because he knew exactly what it was. Over the next few years, more ships appeared, and each time they came closer and stayed longer, and humanity scrambled to respond, and space programs got massive funding, and nations that had been enemies started working together. And Jake watched it all unfold and knew that Lyra had kept her promise, and that the Alliance was watching and waiting. Jake was older now, with gray in his hair and lines on his face, but his eyes were still sharp, and his hope was still strong. And one evening he got a visit from two people in suits who said they were from a government agency, and they had questions about the meteor strike on his farm 20 years ago. He invited them in and made coffee, and they asked if anything unusual had happened that night, and Jake said yes, a meteor hit his field. And they asked if he was sure it was a meteor, and he said what else could it be? And they looked at each other and did not answer. One of them pulled out a scanner and swept it around the room, and it started beeping when it passed near Jake's desk. And they asked if they could search, and Jake said no, but they could leave and never come back. And they tried to argue, but Jake stood his ground, and eventually they left, but he knew they would be back. That night, Jake took the memory crystal from its hiding place and held it up to the moonlight, and it pulsed with warmth, and suddenly it projected a hologram, and there was Lyra, and she was older too, but still beautiful, and she was smiling, and her recorded voice said that if he was seeing this, it meant humanity had been noticed by the Alliance. The hologram Lyra said that her people had been watching Earth, and that humans had proven themselves worthy by not destroying their world and by reaching for the stars with determination and courage, and that soon, very soon, there would be official contact, and when that happened, Jake should present the crystal to the delegation. She said that the crystal contained proof that Earth had already helped the Alliance, and that one human had fought beside one of their scouts and earned their respect, and that this would make the first contact easier and would give humanity a voice in galactic affairs sooner than expected. The hologram faded, but not before Lyra said one more thing, and her voice was soft and full of emotion, and she said that she had never forgotten the farmer who saved her life, and that she was coming back, and that when humanity joined the stars she would be there waiting, and Jake felt tears run down his face. 5 years after the hologram message, Jake Turner sat in a conference room in Washington, surrounded by scientists and military officers and politicians, and they all wanted to know about the crystal that had been found in his possession, and how a simple farmer had technology that was decades ahead of anything on Earth. Jake told them the truth, and he told them everything about the night Lyra crashed on his farm, and the battle with the Empire Hunters, and the promise she made about humanity reaching the stars, and at first they did not believe him. But the crystal itself was proof, and when their scientists analyzed it, they found data that matched signals they had been receiving from the ships in orbit. The president herself came to meet with Jake, and she was younger than he expected and sharp-eyed, and she asked him if he thought the aliens could be trusted, and Jake said that Lyra had trusted him with her life, and he had trusted her with his, and that trust had to start somewhere, and the president nodded slowly and said she hoped he was right. 2 months later, the day came that changed everything, and a ship appeared over New York City in broad daylight, and it was massive and beautiful, and made every human spacecraft look like a child's toy. And it broadcast a message in every language on Earth saying that the Galactic Alliance requested formal diplomatic contact with the people of Earth. Jake was invited to be part of the human delegation, and he stood with presidents and prime ministers and scientists and felt completely out of place in his simple suit. But the crystal was in his pocket, and he knew why he was there. And when the alien shuttle landed in front of the United Nations building, his heart was pounding. Door opened and beings emerged that looked nothing like humans, and Jake saw species with 4 arms, and others that floated, and some that were made of what looked like living crystal, and they were strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. And then he saw her Lyra walk down the ramp, and she wore formal robes that shimmered with stars, and her silver hair was longer now, and her face was exactly as he remembered. And when she saw him, her eyes went wide and bright, and she smiled, and Jake felt 25 years disappear in an instant. The formal greetings took hours, and there were speeches and translations and ceremonies, and Jake stood to the side and watched and waited, and finally Lyra broke protocol and walked over to him, and the other aliens looked surprised but did not stop her, and she stood in front of Jake and said his name like a prayer. He asked if she had really waited all these years, and Lyra said that her people lived longer than humans, and 25 years was not so long, and that she had thought about him every day and wondered if he still remembered her, and Jake laughed and said he had thought about nothing else. They talked while the diplomats negotiated, and Lyra told him about the war and how the Alliance had finally pushed the Empire back and won key victories, and how her people had honor monuments with Jake's name on them, because the intelligence she brought back had helped turn the tide of several battles. Jake told her about his life, and how he had spent years trying to help humanity reach the stars, and how he had never married because no one else had ever made him feel the way she did. And Lyra took his hand, and said that among her people, when 2 souls bonded across the stars, it was considered sacred. The negotiations lasted weeks, and Jake stayed in New York as part of the Earth delegation, and every day he spent time with Lyra, and they walked through Central Park, and she marveled at Earth's nature and its diversity, and he showed her hot dogs and pizza, and she laughed at how humans turned everything into food. One evening, they stood on top of a building and looked out at the city lights, and Lyra said that Earth was beautiful and chaotic and full of potential, and that humans would make good partners in the Alliance, and Jake asked what happened next, and she said that depended on what he wanted. He asked what she meant, and Lyra said that the Alliance had rules about relationships between species, but that those rules had exceptions and that she had waited 25 years and she was not willing to wait anymore, and that if he wanted, she could stay on Earth, or he could come with her to the stars. Jake felt dizzy with possibility, and he said he was just a farmer and she was a war hero, and she said he was the bravest person she had ever met, and that courage was not about superhuman abilities but about choosing to act when action was hard, and that he had taught her people something important about humanity. The Alliance offered Earth membership with certain conditions, and humanity would have to prove itself over time and show it could handle the responsibility of joining a galactic civilization. And in the meantime, there would be technology exchanges and cultural programs, and Earth would have a voice in Alliance councils. Jake was offered a position as Earth's first cultural ambassador, and his job would be to travel among the stars and show other species what humanity was like and to bring back knowledge to help Earth grow, and Lyra would be his guide and partner, and together they would bridge the gap between his young world and the ancient Alliance. He went back to Montana one last time and stood on his farm and looked at the place where Lyra's ship had crashed, and the crater was long gone and the field was green with new wheat and everything looked the same. But he was different, and the world was different, and nothing would ever be simple again. His neighbors came to say goodbye, and they still did not really understand what had happened or why Jake was leaving, but they wished him well and said he had always been a good man, and Jake thanked them and promised to come back someday and tell them stories about the stars. The ship that came for him was smaller than the diplomatic vessel but still impressive, and Lyra was waiting at the door, and she had changed back into her scout armor and looked like the woman who had stumbled out of a crashed ship 25 years ago, except her eyes held less fear and more hope. Jake climbed aboard and the door closed and the ship lifted into the sky, and he watched through the window as Earth grew smaller, and then he could see the whole planet blue and white and green against the black, and he understood why astronauts always said it changed them to see the world from space. Lyra came and stood beside him and took his hand and said, "Welcome to the rest of his life." And Jake said he had been waiting for this moment since the night she crashed on his farm, and she said she knew. And that was why she came back, and that some bonds could not be broken even by time or distance, or the vast emptiness of space. The ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, and stars streaked past the window. And Jake Turner, former farmer from Montana, was heading into the galaxy with an alien woman he loved, and a mission to represent his entire species. And he was terrified and excited, and more alive than he had ever been. Lyra showed him his quarters, and they were simple but comfortable, and she said that tomorrow they would arrive at the Alliance capital, and he would meet the council and begin his training. But tonight they could just be together, and Jake said that sounded perfect. They sat in the observation deck and watched the universe flow past, and Lyra told him stories about the worlds they would visit, and the species they would meet, and the wonders they would see. And Jake listened and held her hand and thought about how strange life was. 25 years ago, he had been sitting on his porch drinking coffee and watching the stars and wishing for something more. And then something more had literally fallen from the sky and crashed into his field and changed everything. And now he was traveling faster than light with the woman he loved and representing his entire planet. Lyra leaned against him and said she was glad she crashed on his farm, and Jake said he was glad too, and they sat in comfortable silence and watched the stars. And Jake knew that this was just the beginning, and that ahead of them lay adventures and challenges and discoveries that he could not imagine. But whatever came next, they would face it together, and humanity would rise to meet the galaxy. And Jake Turner would be there to help his people take their first steps among the stars, and somewhere back on Earth in a wheat field in Montana, a new generation would look up at the night sky and dream of the impossible,